Hi, I'm Nikolai, aka 56 Miner. Today we'll be unboxing our March Premium box, which is all about illustration markers. We'll talk about light, form, and I'll share some tips and tricks that I picked up on my art journey. Let's get into it. Our first item is a custom graphics marker set from Marabou. The set's really interesting as it comes with 3 alcohol-based markers, a blender, and 2 permanent. Let's grab our pad, the Ad Maker marker paper. This bright white marker paper is really unique in its properties and is great for markers because it avoids bleed. Because the paper is a little bit hydrophobic, we can actually blend colors more painterly than we would on traditional paper. Let's use our pad to swatch out our markers. The sketch markers in this set come with 2 nibs. First is going to be a chisel tip, which is great for thick lines, filling in areas. The other nib, a bullet nib, is going to be good for consistent lines that don't have any line weight variance to them. Let's swatch out our colors to get an idea of how they look on the pad. Blenders are a great tool in creating transitions between colors. Here I'll take a brilliant violet and the permanent pink, and by putting a little bit of that blender medium on the pad first, I'll create a smooth transition between the 2 colors. When combining 2 colors of a large value difference, so really dark and really light colors, you'll have to go over a few times to smooth out that transition. Moving on to the permanent markers in this set, these markers come with a standard bullet nib, which is great for those solid lines, and a fine liner, which is great for detail work or adding in some texture. Now, because these are permanent markers, they won't blend like our alcohol-based markers, but they're good for flat color. The next item in our box is the Copic Sketch in V12 or Pale Lilac. These markers come with a chisel tip similar to our Marabou set, but they also include a brush nib, which offers a lot of flexibility in creating organic shapes. Try alternating the pressure that you use when holding the marker to help get those thick and thin lines. Next, we have a Copic Classic in V15 or Mallow. These markers come with a bullet nib that's slightly thicker than the one on our Marabou set, and they also come with a chisel tip, which is great for those large areas. Our final 2 items in this month's box are going to be 2 Spectra Ad markers in Wine and Walnut. These markers come with a chisel tip as well as a brush tip, which offers a lot of versatility, and are a perfect complement to the cadmium red and cocoa colors found in our Marabou set. When combining colors, there's generally 2 ways to go about it. You can start with a darker color and fan that color out with a blender, or you can start by laying down a base color and building your colors from there. The latter typically results in a smoother blend that has a good color harmony to it. When using high pigment markers like our permanent violet, you can actually use the blender to push some of that pigment out and make details. This technique typically works best with darker colors or really juicy markers. Using the permanent marker in our set, we can create some stems for our flowers. It's good to be conscious of how much pressure you're applying when using illustration markers, as that can affect how much pigment you place on the paper. Here we can use that to our advantage to create some floral shapes where the value is lighter in the center by lifting up when we pull away from the paper. You can also build value by layering and pushing harder to get that darker center. Because our pad is specifically designed to work with illustration markers, we don't need to worry too much about bleed through. Now that we have a good understanding of our materials, let's do a bit of a warm-up. This month I wanted to introduce you to a practice that can really help your marker control. I'll start with 2 lines, and this will be the beginning and end point of a ribbon. This ribbon will allow us to kind of think in 3-dimensional space and get us in the mindset of a good drawing. Try going in with a loose but quick hand to make your marks so that they can come out as smooth as possible, and take your time. This is less about creating the perfect ribbon and more about getting your hand and your eyes to work together. As you get more comfortable, you can try to depict more complex angles and twists and turns. This is also a great tool to use when trying to depict hair, as it allows you to focus more on the sections of the hair instead of the individual strand. We can make these look a little bit more three-dimensional by focusing some shading on the bends in the ribbon. Since our pad is that bright white, it's always going to want to push towards the foreground, and darker areas are going to want to recede into the background. By adding our shading strategically, we can be conscious of this and kind of use it to sell a three-dimensional effect. Let's take our mallow color and push that illusion of depth even further. Creating those transitions with the blender marker does take some time, as you will need to go back and forth over it in order to create those smooth transitions. If you're not too worried about creating the softest transitions, you don't have to go over and repeat it. It's really just a matter of taste. By adding some shading to the start and stop of our ribbons and where it bends, we can push that illusion of three-dimensionality even further. Finally, I'll take the cocoa marker and the fine liner and just go around the edges of our ribbons. This will help to separate it out from the background and just kind of clean it up visually. Now, color combinations with illustration markers can be a bit tricky, so here I've gone ahead and swatched out all the color combinations available to us in our set. I did this by going from top to bottom and then left to right, as sometimes depending on how you layer the marker, it'll create different colors. Last month, we spent some time talking about the importance of still lifes and building things using light and color, so this month I wanted to walk you through the steps of creating a realistic drawing. We'll go from sketch to final render, and these principles really apply to anything that you want to draw. Taking a light marker, I'll go in and start my base sketch. This is really just you trying to capture the general shape of the objects, and it's good to start thinking about the light. I know that my light source is going to be to the top right, so it'll have a cast shadow to the bottom left. Next, I'll start filling in areas of shadow, using that blender in order to kind of smooth out those edges. Don't be too concerned with that at these early stages, as those edges typically blend out and become softer as you layer more pigment. Because our paper is such a brilliant white, all we're really doing is darkening up areas to match that shadow. Because we already know our brightest point. Our brightest point will be wherever the least amount of marker is. If you have a hard time kind of thinking in terms of value and light and shadow, a good trick is to take a photo of your subject matter, or if you're working from a photo, turn it to black and white. By creating a black and white image, you're just focusing on value and you're kind of filtering out anything that has to do with color. At this point, you can start to really see that three-dimensional effect, and you can see that a lot of those harsh lines that we started with have been blended out either by the blender itself or by layering more color. Since I took the time to build out the value range using the Copic markers and really identify our areas of light and shadow, I can go in with the Spectra Add marker and add in some more of that characteristic red to make it look more like a real-life pomegranate. If you feel like your blender marker gets too much pigment on it, you can always clean it by rubbing it off on a spare scrap sheet of paper. This will help to keep your colors and your values clear when you're using it to mix. For my deepest and darkest shadows in the piece, I'll use that permanent violet since it's our darkest blendable marker. if you ever put too much pigment, you might be able to lift a little bit of it off with that blender as well. So if areas get too dark, use that as a way to kind of bring back some light into the area. As a final step, I always like to go back in and rework a few areas just to help balance out those values, because we might have had some areas that are a little bit too light now that we've darkened up other areas. It's really the value relationship between light and dark that sells the realism in any kind of artwork that's trying to depict light and form. And with that, our piece is done. Hope you enjoyed the video, learned a few things, and if you post your work online, make sure you use #SketchBoxMarch. We love seeing what y'all create each month, and I'll see you next month.